The broken notes of Bach echoed through the deserted lobby of Lincoln Center at 2 in the morning as Sarah Mitchell, 35-year-old janitor in her blue maintenance uniform, played a violin missing 2 strings. She thought she was alone as she cleaned the marble floors that the giants of music had walked on hours before. But from the shadows of the grand columns, Harrison Blackwood, the world's most feared music critic, listened paralyzed. The man who had destroyed careers with a single review now wept in silence. Because in those imperfect notes, in that broken violin played by calloused hands, there was more truth than in all the $1,000 ticket concerts he'd ever reviewed. But the real shock came when Blackwood discovered who Sarah really was, the violin prodigy who 12 years earlier had vanished from the world stage the night of her Carnegie Hall debut, when everyone expected her to become the next Hilary Hahn. And now, here she was, cleaning the floors of music's temple, with an 8-year-old son sleeping in the janitor's closet, and a secret that could destroy New York's entire musical elite. Lincoln Center slept in the silence of 2 in the morning, its cream limestone and modernist glass hidden in darkness. Only the service lights illuminated the monumental lobby, where Sarah Mitchell pushed her cleaning cart across the travertine floors. 35 years lived like 100. The hands that once made audiences weep across the world now gripped the handle of a mop. She had just finished cleaning the footprints left by Jimmy Choo's and polished Oxfords when she saw it, the violin forgotten under a bench. It wasn't a Stradivarius or a Guarneri, just a student instrument probably left by some distracted orchestra member. 2 of the 4 strings were broken, the wood scratched, the bow warped. Sarah picked it up with the same delicacy one would use to hold a wounded bird. Her fingers automatically found the position, 12 years of absence dissolving at first contact. She began with Bach, the chaconne from Partita No. 2, the one her mother had taught her when she was 6, and her hands were too small for the positions. With only 2 strings, she had to reinvent everything, find new fingerings, create impossible harmonies. But the music flowed anyway, broken and beautiful, like her life. She didn't know that Harrison Blackwood had remained in the center after the gala concert, hidden in his private box, writing the review that would destroy the career of the young violinist who had dared to play Paganini without the necessary soul. The British critic, 70 years of refined cynicism, had heard the notes rising from below and descended, ready to rebuke whoever dared profane the sacred silence of Lincoln Center. But when he saw the scene, he stopped. A janitor in a blue uniform, surrounded by buckets and rags, was transforming a broken violin into something sublime. It wasn't the technical perfection that Blackwood had always sought and never found. It was something rarer, truth. Every note carried the weight of an untold story, every pause charged with restrained pain. The critic, who hadn't cried since his wife's funeral 20 years ago, felt tears streak his face. Sarah played for 20 minutes, lost in a world where there were no bills to pay, where her son Jason didn't have to hide in the closet during night shifts, where talent was enough to survive. When the last note faded into the air, the silence that followed was thick as honey. It was then she heard the applause. Slow, solitary applause coming from the shadow of the columns. Sarah spun around, the violin almost falling from her hands. Harrison Blackwood emerged into the dim light, his face a mask of amazement and something that resembled remorse. Sarah recognized him immediately. How could she forget the man who had written, "Young Mitchell has the fingers of an angel, but the soul of an accountant. Her impeccable technique cannot hide the emotional void at the center of her art." That review, published the day after her Carnegie Hall debut, had destroyed her. Contracts canceled, agents no longer returning calls. The house of cards of success collapsed in one night. The 2 figures stared at each other across the lobby, the janitor who had been a star, and the critic who had extinguished that star. Blackwood spoke first, his voice hoarse with restrained emotion. He said that in 30 years, He'd never heard anything like it. That there was more music in those two broken strings than in all the perfect concerts he'd reviewed. Sarah laughed, a bitter sound that echoed among the columns. She explained it was easy to play with soul when soul was all you had left. When your husband died in Afghanistan when you were 23, leaving you with a newborn. When you had to choose between buying formula or paying rent. When the only job you could find was cleaning the theater where you were once the promise of the century. At that moment, a small noise came from the janitor's closet. The door opened and Jason appeared. 8 years of tousled curls and eyes that were the same as his mother's. He clutched a worn teddy bear and looked at the two adults with the precocious wisdom of children who have seen too much. Blackwood stared at the child as if he'd seen a ghost. Jason had Sarah's intense gaze, but there was something more, something painfully familiar in the curve of his smile, in the way he tilted his head when curious. The critic leaned against a column, his legs suddenly weak. Sarah quickly gathered Jason in her arms, whispering that everything was fine, that he could go back to sleep. But the boy looked at Blackwood with those eyes that seemed to see through people. Then he said something that froze both adults' blood. "Are you the grandfather from the photos? The one Mom said was too important to know me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah held Jason tighter, her face a mask of shock and rising anger. Blackwood had turned white as Lincoln Center's limestone. The truth he'd buried for 8 years was emerging like a corpse from the river. Catherine Blackwood, the daughter Harrison had disowned when she dared marry a soldier instead of the conductor he'd chosen. Catherine, who had died in childbirth 8 years ago, without her father answering a single letter, call, or plea for reconciliation. Catherine, who had been married to David Mitchell, Sarah's brother. Sarah put Jason down and told him to get his backpack, that they'd go home soon. When the boy disappeared into the closet, she turned to Blackwood with cold fury in her eyes. She told him everything. How David and Catherine had loved each other despite Harrison's disapproval. How they'd married in secret, hoping one day Blackwood would forgive them. How Catherine had cried every night of her pregnancy, wanting her father to know his grandson. How she'd died calling her father's name, still hoping for a reconciliation that never came. David had died in Afghanistan 6 months later, leaving Sarah as Jason's guardian. She'd been rising in her career, scheduled for a world tour, recording contracts lined up, but she'd given it all up to raise her nephew, the boy who was both her family's greatest tragedy and greatest gift. Blackwood collapsed onto a bench, his mask of arrogance completely dissolved. He confessed his stupidity, his pride that had destroyed everything. He'd written that devastating review about Sarah not because she lacked talent, but because she was David's sister, part of the family that had stolen his daughter. He'd thought that by destroying Sarah's career, he'd somehow punish the Mitchells for taking Catherine. Instead, he'd condemned his daughter to die without her father's forgiveness and his grandson to grow up in poverty. But there was more. Blackwood revealed he wasn't there by chance that night. For months, someone had been sending him anonymous recordings of a violinist playing in the late hours at Lincoln Center. The technique was different, rawer, but there was something in the musical phrasing that reminded him of young Sarah Mitchell. He'd come to discover who this phantom musician was, never imagining it would be the very woman he'd destroyed. Sarah laughed bitterly. Of course she played differently. Hands ruined by cleaning chemicals, fingers stiffened by cold nights of cleaning, back broken from carrying buckets and ladders. But music was the only thing that kept her sane. Every night, after Jason fell asleep in the closet, she played for David and Catherine, to remember them, to talk to them, to ask forgiveness for not being able to give Jason the life he deserved. Jason reappeared with his small backpack, but instead of going to his aunt, he approached Blackwood. He handed him a crumpled notebook. These were drawings he made during long nights in the theater. Drawings of flying violins, of notes becoming birds, of an imaginary grandfather who would one day come to take him to concerts instead of hiding him in closets. Blackwood took the notebook with trembling hands. In every page he saw Catherine as a child, the same artistic talent, the same innocence he'd betrayed with his pride. The tears he'd held back for 20 years exploded into sobs that echoed in the empty theater. The following weeks were surreal. Blackwood returned every night to Lincoln Center, no longer as the feared critic, but as a silent shadow listening to Sarah play. He brought better and better violins, hiding them where he knew Sarah would find them. First a decent instrument with all its strings, then a French violin from 1890, finally a Gagliano from 1750, worth more than Sarah would earn in 10 lifetimes. Sarah initially refused these gifts, but Jason had begun waiting for the secret grandfather with childish excitement. Blackwood brought him Swiss chocolates, books of British fairy tales, small treasures the boy hid in his backpack, like talismans against the poverty surrounding him. One night, while Sarah played Brahms' Violin Concerto in D major, adapted for solo violin, Blackwood made the proposal that would change everything. He wanted to organize a concert, not just any concert, but an event at Carnegie Hall, advertised as the return of the prodigal daughter. Sarah Mitchell returning after 12 years of silence, with a revolutionary program. Classical music arranged for 2-string violin, a tribute to beauty born from deprivation. Sarah laughed until she cried. Had he lost his mind? A janitor playing on Carnegie Hall's stage, with ruined hands, without years of preparation, without even a gown to wear? But Blackwood was serious, deadly serious. He said he'd spent his life destroying talents only to realize too late that true talent wasn't in technical perfection, but in the soul put into the music. Sarah had that soul, forged by pain and loss. The real problem wasn't the music. It was the secret Sarah had kept for 12 years. The reason she'd really disappeared after Carnegie Hall wasn't just the devastating review. That night, after the concert, she'd discovered something that had destroyed her faith in the classical music world. Her manager, along with several members of Carnegie Hall's board, ran an underground betting ring on young talents. They bet on who would become famous, who would crash.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Manipulating careers like pieces on a chessboard. Sarah had proof. Recordings, documents, bank transfers. But when she'd threatened to expose everything, they'd made it clear that not only would her career end, but accidents could happen. With David deployed and Catherine pregnant, she couldn't risk it. So she disappeared, becoming invisible, protecting her family with anonymity. Blackwood listened in silence, his face growing darker. He knew all the names Sarah mentioned. Some were his friends, people he dined with regularly, whom he reviewed favorably. The corruption he'd always suspected but chosen to ignore was thrown in his face. It was Jason who decided for them. One night, while the two adults argued, the boy took the broken violin, the one with 2 strings, and began to play. He didn't know how to play, obviously, but he imitated his aunt's movements, creating strident, random sounds that somehow formed a primitive and powerful melody. When he finished, he simply said, "Aunt Sarah, Mom always said music is for everyone, not just the rich." The news of Sarah Mitchell's return exploded in the classical music world like an atomic bomb. Newspapers went wild. The phantom violinist returns after 12 years of silence. From success to janitor, the fall and rebirth of a genius. But the real blow was the program announcement. Bach, Brahms, and Paganini played on a 2-string violin, the same broken violin Sarah had found that fateful night. The music world divided. Some cried sacrilege, others genius. Tickets sold out in 3 hours, with the black market reselling them for $10,000 each. Carnegie Hall hadn't seen such fervor since Yo-Yo Ma's last performance. But behind the scenes, War had begun. Sarah's old manager, Richard Sterling, now one of the most powerful men in American classical music, understood the threat. If Sarah talked, if she revealed the betting system and manipulations, the entire house of cards would collapse. The pressure began. Veiled threats, astronomical money offers to cancel the concert, attempts to bribe Carnegie Hall technicians to sabotage the event. Sarah continued cleaning floors by day and preparing by night. Her hands bled after hours of practice, the calluses from chemicals opening under the pressure of the strings. Jason watched her with childish concern, bringing Band-Aids and magic kisses to heal the wounds. Blackwood used all his influence to protect the concert. He wrote passionate editorials about the need for renewal in classical music, about beauty born from limitation, about Sarah's courage in reinventing the classics. For the first time in 30 years, the world's most feared critic wasn't criticizing but celebrating. The night of the concert, December 15th, New York was paralyzed. Police had to manage the crowd outside Carnegie Hall. Inside, 2,000 people held their breath. The world's musical elite was present. Conductors, soloists, critics, patrons, but also janitors, waitresses, broke students who'd won the lottery for popular tickets that Sarah had insisted be available. When Sarah walked onto the stage, she wasn't wearing a gown but her clean, pressed work uniform. She carried the broken violin like a relic. The silence was so deep you could hear the audience breathing. Then, from the box seats, a small voice shouted, "Go, Mom!" It was Jason, sitting next to Blackwood, dressed in his best outfit, which was still too small and patched. The audience laughed. The tension broke for a moment. Sarah smiled at her son, then positioned the violin, and began to play. The first notes of Bach's Chaconne resonated in Carnegie Hall as they'd never resonated before. With only 2 strings, Sarah had to completely reinvent the score, find new harmonies, create impossible polyphonies. Her fingers danced in positions no teacher would have taught, the bow defying every technical convention. But from limitation came freedom. From poverty of means emerged an emotional richness that left the audience breathless. As she played, Sarah told her story without words. Every note was a memory. Meeting David and Catherine's love, Jason's birth, the nights in the hospital after Catherine died, David's military funeral, the years of loneliness and survival. The violin cried, laughed, screamed, whispered. It was no longer an instrument, but an extension of Sarah's soul. The audience was paralyzed. Some wept openly. Others held their neighbors' hands, seeking an anchor to reality. Professional musicians watched with a mix of envy and awe. Everything they'd studied for years was being overturned, yet the result was undeniably sublime. Halfway through the concert, Sarah stopped. Silence fell like a blanket. Then she began to speak. She told of the corruption in the classical music world, of young talents destroyed for bets, of critics paid to destroy or exalt, of directors who traded careers for sexual favors. As she spoke, she projected on a screen behind her the documents she'd kept for 12 years. Chaos exploded. Some in the audience tried to get up and leave, but the majority stopped them. Sterling, sitting in the front row, was white as a corpse. Journalists present typed frantically on their phones. The concert's live stream was going viral worldwide. But Sarah wasn't finished. She resumed playing, this time Paganini's Caprice No. 24, the most difficult piece in the violin repertoire, made nearly impossible with just 2 strings. It was a declaration. Even broken, even limited, true talent always finds a way. As her fingers flew over the strings, the audience saw her hands bleeding, blood staining the violin's wood. But Sarah didn't stop. The last note resonated in the hall, and for 10 seconds, no one moved. Then, like a wave, the audience rose to its feet. The applause lasted 20 minutes, with shouts of "Encore!" that made the chandelier's crystals tremble. But Sarah didn't play an encore. Instead, She called Jason onto the stage. The boy ran to his aunt, hugging her without caring about the blood on her hands. Then he turned to the audience and said in his small voice, "My aunt is a hero, not because she can play, but because she never gave up." The theater exploded in another round of applause, this time not for the music, but for the naked truth of a child who loved his guardian. 6 months after the concert that had shaken the classical music world, everything had changed. Richard Sterling was in prison along with 12 other music executives. The corruption system had been dismantled, with investigations opened across America. Blackwood had used his influence to create a foundation supporting young talented musicians from poor families. Sarah no longer cleaned Lincoln Center's floors. She'd been named director of the theater's new experimental music program, where classical and street musicians collaborated to create new art forms. Her method of playing with broken or limited instruments had become a school of thought, with conservatories worldwide inviting Sarah for master classes. But the biggest change was in her personal life. Blackwood had sold his penthouse on the Upper East Side and bought a modest apartment near Sarah and Jason. Every day, he walked his grandson to school. Every evening, he dined with them. He was trying to make up for lost years, knowing he could never compensate for his absence when Catherine was alive, but determined to be the grandfather Jason deserved. Jason had started studying violin, but also piano, composition, and dance. Not because anyone forced him, but because music was in his blood. Sarah had sworn she'd never push him toward a musical career, but Jason had his own ideas. At 9 years old, he'd already composed his first sonata for 2-string violin, dedicated to Aunt Sarah, who taught me that beauty comes from difficulties. One evening, while they dined in their new home, a real apartment, not service quarters anymore, Blackwood pulled out an old box. Inside were all the letters Catherine had written him that he'd never opened. Tears streamed down his face as he read them aloud. Catherine spoke of David with infinite love, of Jason with maternal pride, and incredibly, she forgave her father for his absence. The last letter, written from her hospital bed, contained a request. "Dad, if you ever read this, find Sarah and Jason. Help them. Not for me, but for you. The love you refuse is the love that destroys you. The love you give, even late, is the love that saves you." That night, after Jason had gone to bed, the 3 adults who had been broken by life sat in the living room. Sarah took the violin. She now had a good one. An anonymous gift from an admirer who signed only "a janitor who found her music," and began to play. Not Bach or Brahms, but a simple melody Catherine always sang. Blackwood closed his eyes, and for the first time in years felt peace. He couldn't save his daughter, but he could honor her memory by caring for the family she'd left behind. Sarah played with hands still marked, but healed, no longer bleeding, but strong. And Jason, pretending to sleep, listened from his room and smiled, knowing he finally had a complete family, even if unconventional. The epilogue to this story is written 10 years later. Jason Mitchell Blackwood, 19 years old, is about to debut at the Royal Opera House in London. Not as a violinist, but as composer and conductor of his first symphony, written for traditional orchestra and ensemble of broken instruments. Dedicated to his aunt, who taught him that limitation is just another form of freedom, and to his grandfather, who learned too late but not in vain that love is the only review that matters. Sarah sits in the front row, her hands now too stiff to play professionally, but still capable of applauding. Next to her, Blackwood, 82 years old, holds the last review he'll ever write. It's not a critique, but a love letter to music, to family, to redemption. The concert begins with a 2-string violin solo, played by a young woman who learned the Mitchell method. The notes resonate in the hall, carrying with them the story of a janitor who became legend not when she was perfect, but when she was broken. And as the music fills the Royal Opera House, somewhere Catherine and David smile, knowing that in the end love won, as it always does when given enough time. The broken violin that started it all is now in a case at Lincoln Center Museum, with a plaque that reads, "Beauty lies not in the perfection of the instrument, but in the imperfection of the soul that plays it." Thousands of visitors each year stop before that violin, and some swear they can still hear the notes from that night when a janitor played for ghosts and a critic learned to cry. Hit like if you believe true talent survives everything. Comment with the moment that touched your heart. Share for all the invisible artists who deserve to be heard. Subscribe for more stories of music, redemption, and rebirth. Sometimes the most beautiful notes come from broken strings. Sometimes the harshest critics need the gentlest lesson. And sometimes, just sometimes, a janitor playing at 2 in the morning can change the world of music forever.